Hello, and welcome to this Year 12 session for the St John's College Inspire Digital programme. I'm Alex. I'm a current PhD student at St John's, and I study human geography. And today we're going to be looking at the topic of geopolitical anomalies and what they can teach us about social science and the world. But before we start, I wanted to tell you a little bit about who I am and my academic career to date. I grew up in Essex, and at school I always found that I had a very broad set of academic interests, and I couldn't decide if I preferred the humanities, the sciences, or the social sciences. This was reflected in my A-level choices, where I studied geography, geology, and chemistry for A-level, and classical civilizations and English literature for AS level. I decided that I wanted to study geography at university, so I could continue studying both the arts, in the form of human geography, and the sciences, in the form of physical geography, as well as exploring how humans and the environment interact. It's important to mention here that the Oxford Geography course only requires 3 A-level subjects, and there are no particular subject requirements. Even geography is not essential, although encouraged. Students come with a wide range of A-level subjects, including all sciences, all arts subjects, and a combination of both. It's also worth mentioning that some students don't come with A-levels at all, and instead have international qualifications or the International Baccalaureate. For those of you who are interested in geography, the Oxford course is very broad, requiring you to study physical and human geography in the first year, before giving you opportunities to specialise later on. I specialised in human geography, particularly in political geography and the geography of India, although I also took a specialist physical geography module in desert landscapes and dynamics. After finishing my undergraduate degree, I decided that I wanted to continue studying and began a taught master's course in geopolitics and security at Royal Holloway, University of London. That's the picture of the brick building on the slide. As the name suggests, geopolitics involves the intersection between politics and geography, exploring how politics is impacted by geographical factors and how it varies across space. This course offered preparation for continued academic research, as well as practical skills for those wanting to pursue careers in security, government, or policy. After my master's course, I worked in 2 different jobs. First in a school helping students to apply to university, and then in a research institute, helping government and charitable organisations develop educational policy. I found the skills I'd gained at university really useful for both of these jobs. The academic knowledge I'd learnt about policy and social science, as well as the practical skills like writing, assimilating large amounts of information, and working under pressure, were all invaluable. Whilst I really loved my job, I realised that I wanted to continue studying and returned to St John's last year for a PhD. A PhD is a 3 or a 4-year research degree where you work to develop new knowledge in your field. Unlike an undergraduate degree, where you have regular lectures and tutorials, a PhD is more like a job, where you work with a supervisor who's a specialist in your field to research a specific topic that no one else has ever studied before. My PhD looks at the lives of young people living in northeast India and touches upon many of the topics that we'll cover today. So today's lecture is entitled Geopolitical Anomalies, What Can They Teach Us? This is mostly based on material covered in the geography degree here at Oxford, but also draws on a little bit of my own research. This session will be split into 3 parts. First, we'll consider what's considered the norm in geopolitics by asking, what is a state? Then we'll move on to consider 3 examples of geopolitical anomalies, looking at governments in exile, micronations, and no man's lands. And finally, we'll end by thinking about what geopolitical anomalies can teach us, more broadly, for geography and for politics, and for the future. At times throughout this presentation, I've included some questions for you to think through. At these points, I'd recommend you pause the presentation for a minute or 2 to think through the answers. You can then restart the presentation and we'll explore them together. But before we do any of that, I wanted to start by unpacking what we mean by a geopolitical anomaly. As I said earlier, geopolitics is the study of the relationship between geography and politics. So here, when we say geopolitics, we're thinking about how the world is organised spatially. That is, how is it divided into a map of the world, for example into different blocks of countries, regions, and continents. Meanwhile, anomalies refer to things that deviate or are different to what's considered normal. So bringing these things together, Geopolitical anomalies refer to ways of organising global political space which deviates or is different from the normal map of countries, known as states, of the world. But if this lecture is focused on geopolitical anomalies and the abnormal, we need to first understand what's considered normal within geopolitics, and this is the modern territorial state. But what do we mean by a state? Take a minute now to pause the presentation and think about where you've heard this word before and what it means. Okay, hopefully now you've had some time to think. It's worth mentioning that there are actually lots of different ways that we can define a state, and states come in lots of different forms. But normally, and for the purposes of this presentation, a state is understood as a political entity which has sovereignty over a given portion of territory. This is shown here by this equation where a territorial state equals territory plus sovereignty. By sovereignty here, we mean having the ultimate power over a political community or groups. This means that whoever has sovereignty has the final say over any decision made within their territory. And by territory here, we mean a portion of the Earth's surface that's claimed or associated by that group. So a state exists when one person, institution, or group has the ultimate power over a given area of space and the people living within it. So that sounds a bit abstract, but let's give you an example. So here we can see the state of the United Kingdom, and it's made up of the territorial space of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and sovereignty is held by the UK Parliament at Westminster. We can complicate this slightly by thinking about how this territory is split up into smaller portions of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland and England, and how some of this power is held by regional parliaments in Edinburgh and Cardiff and Belfast. But in general, this is a pretty good place to start. So this understanding of the modern state, this association between sovereignty over a given portion of territory, came into being in 1648 following a conflict known as the 30 Years' War. As the name suggests, this was one of the longest and most violent wars in history, involving nearly every state in Europe. To end the war, most of the world's political leaders gathered together in what is now Germany and signed the Treaty of Westphalia. This treaty aimed to prevent future wars by declaring that the world was made up of individual states who have the ultimate power within their territorial borders and who were recognised by other states. What this basically means is that they were left to do things as they liked, as long as they stuck within their own borders. The number of states has steadily grown following decolonisation throughout the 20th century as European and North American powers gave up their empires around the world. So a state normally is thought to have the following 6 things. First, some kind of land or territory which it occupies. Second, sovereignty or ultimate power over that territory. That basically means that they have the final decision over what goes on within that territory, and no one else has more power than them. Third, a permanent population. Fourth, a government which exercises the sovereign power held by that state. Fifth, an economy which allows people to interact with each other through trade and is supported by the state, for example through a state currency. And finally, recognition. This means that other existing states publicly acknowledge and accept that any new state exists and that they are in fact a state. This can take the form of entering into diplomatic relations or treaties with other states, or through becoming a member of international organisations like the United Nations. We're going to talk a little bit more about the importance of recognition later in this presentation. So when we bring all of these things together, we normally come up with a geopolitical map of the world that looks something like this, where the whole of the Earth's land surface, apart from Antarctica, is covered by states. In theory, all of these states or countries meet the 6 criteria outlined above, though as we'll learn later today, the situation is a little bit more complex. So according to this map, each individual belongs to a nation, which is basically a large group of people united by a common history, culture, or language. So the people of France, for example, belong to the French nation. Each nation then belongs to a state, and every state has overall sovereignty within their territory. So that's how political scientists and theorists normally think about how global politics operates. But today, we're going to look at some ideas that challenge our idea of what constitutes a state, and how the world is organised geopolitically by looking at geopolitical anomalies. There are a huge number of geopolitical anomalies, but today we're just going to focus on 3. The first example I want to look at then are governments in exile. What we mean by this are political groups who claim to be a state's legitimate government but are unable to exercise their legal powers within the state they claim to represent, and instead are based in a foreign country. The reasons for this can include war, political revolution or instability, or the occupation of one state by another. For those of you who study history, this might sound quite familiar. In the Second World War, Allied governments from across Europe set up governments in exile in the UK, following occupation of their home countries by Axis powers. On this slide we can see a plaque marking the location of the Norwegian government in exile in London, a picture of the leader of the French Free State, Charles de Gaulle, who led the French government in exile and later became French Prime Minister, and on the right, a picture of the representatives of the Polish government in exile at a meeting in London in the 1940s. By the end of the war, at least 8 European governments were located in London, where they engaged in diplomatic relations and attempted to support the resistance efforts in their home countries. But the example I want to look at today is a little bit more contemporary. This is the Tibetan government in exile. This example is based on research done by Dr. Fiona McConnell, whose picture is on this slide, and who's based in the geography department here and teaches at St Catherine's College. Fiona's recently written a book on the Tibetan government in exile, and I've included a picture of that on the top of the slide. As we can see from this map, Tibet is located between China and India. In the 1950s, the Chinese army entered Tibet and declared that Tibet was, and always had been, part of China. 8 years later, the army crushed a Tibetan uprising in the capital, Lhasa, and the Tibetan spiritual and political leader, the Dalai Lama, crossed the Himalayas with 80,000 Tibetan refugees and re-established Tibetan government in settlements across North India. This government was set up with 2 main aims: to look after the refugee community and to restore freedom to Tibet. Since then, the exile community has continued to expand and has become well established at a number of dispersed sites across India, Nepal, and Bhutan. Most of these are in India, and it leases these sites from the Indian government on a long-term basis. These are shown on the map of the slide. The largest settlement is in the North Indian district of Dharamsala, which you can see on the north of the map. In total, the Tibetan community now numbers around 130,000 people in exile, 3/4 of whom live in India. In many ways, the government in exile appears to possess lots of the key features of a modern state. It has a prime minister and holds elections to seats in the exile parliament. There are a range of different government departments, and the government provides basic services like healthcare and education. It issues identity documents, and it collects some voluntary taxes. The government also engages in diplomatic activities, for example by setting up embassies in other countries and holding press conferences. In this sense then, it looks like the government definitely holds some kind of sovereignty within the exiled settlements, where it definitely has authority over Tibetan citizens. And these settlements definitely feel very Tibetan, and are spaces where Tibetan culture is preserved outside of the homeland. Take 30 seconds. How do you think the Tibetan government in exile compares against our definition of what constitutes a state? So, looking at our 6 criteria, it's clear that the Tibetan government in exile does possess some kind of permanent population, located within the 3 countries I just talked about. Second, it definitely has a functioning government and provides things like healthcare, education. Third, it has an organised economy, and it collects taxes. However, when we go back to our equation at the start of the lecture, the government in exile still appears to lack the crucial ingredients required for a state: ultimate sovereignty over a given territory. The exile government is still located within India, which means that the Indian state has ultimate control over the space it occupies, and it could in theory ask them to leave at any time. The exile government is also unable to set up its own police force and military. It has no borders to defend, and you'll rarely see Tibetan settlements marked on a map. The state also lacks formal recognition by other countries. McConnell then suggests that rather than possessing de jure sovereignty, which is basically the legal term for having sovereignty in the eyes of the law, the government in exile possesses what she terms de facto sovereignty. What this really means, or translates directly to, is sovereignty by fact. This means that the government in exile does lots of the things that a state normally does, and on the ground possesses some kind of sovereignty or power over its people and their day-to-day lives, for example in the form of education and healthcare. But the government in exile lacks full sovereignty, which includes control over territory and is not a legally recognised state. This then complicates the equation that I showed you earlier, that all states equal territory plus sovereignty, and suggests that some kind of partial sovereignty can be exercised without a state possessing full control over territory. As political scientists and geographers, this is really interesting, because it gives us a glimpse of a wide range of different geopolitical entities that can exist, and the ways in which power can operate. It also has some more practical implications for thinking about different geopolitical futures, which we'll explore later. Take a look at the picture in front of you. What can you see? You might just be able to see an abandoned lump of concrete in the middle of the sea, and that's correct. But this is also the Principality of Sealand, a micronation located in the North Sea. Sealand came into existence in 1967 when a former British Army officer called Roy Bates travelled to this World War II Navy pontoon, located 12 kilometres off the coast of Suffolk, and declared it his own country. Since the pontoon was located outside of British territorial waters, Bates declared that he could proclaim himself King Roy and his family royalty. Although Bates died in 2012, Sealand is now led by his son, known as Prince Michael. The platform has its own constitution, currency, passports, flags, national anthem, and even its own football team, made up of Bates's family. And when we look back to our list of what makes a state then, it seems that Sealand ticks a lot of the boxes. It has a patch of land, albeit quite a small one, which counts as some kind of territory. It has a permanent population, and although Bates has now died, his family live on Sealand for much of the year. It sort of has a government, which definitely has some kind of sovereignty or power over the platform, run by Bates as king, and his family as the royal family. It has an economy. Sealand sells citizenship and knighthoods online. And if you want to become a lord, lady, duke, or duchess of Sealand, you can go to their website, and for a large sum of money, you can get a formal title. But what Sealand is lacking, however, is formal recognition. This means that no other state has formally acknowledged that Sealand exists. This would normally happen through an official government announcement, or through membership of international organisations like the United Nations, or treaties between states. Recognition by other states is what separates micronations, like Sealand, from microstates, like Liechtenstein or Monaco, which are also very small, but are recognised by other countries and international organisations. Aware of how important, then, recognition is, Bates has tried to claim that Sealand has been recognised by a number of other countries, including Germany. In 1978, a German citizen attempted to take control of Sealand while Bates was away from the platform. When Bates returned and retook the platform by force, including with the use of a helicopter, he held the Germans hostage until the German government sent a diplomat to engage in negotiations for their release. For Bates, this counts as a formal example of recognition. The UK Foreign Office, however, claims that Sealand cannot constitute a separate independent state since it has none of the characteristics of a state, which it claims are a fixed population, a land territory, and the ability to conduct international relations. In 1982, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea extended the UK's waters to include the platform. The convention also stated that artificial islands, installations and structures do not possess the status of islands, and they have no territorial sea of their own. Bates, of course, and his family rejected this claim. Sealand, then, is just a number of many micronations located around the world. Others include those set up as a joke, as part of arts projects, or as forms of political protest or social experiment. Whether or not you agree with Bates and his family that Sealand counts as a country, as geographers and political scientists, micronations can help us really think about those things that actually make up a state. By thinking through the things that Sealand does to try and become a state, as well as the ways in which it kind of looks like a state but still isn't taken seriously in the international system, we can learn how important things like recognition and international agreements are in shaping our present-day map of the world. So the final example I want to look at are no man's lands. First, I want you to take 30 seconds. What do you think of when you first hear the phrase no man's lands? It's likely that a lot of you will have thought about the battlefields of World War I, where no man's land described the narrow strip of land between the enemy trenches in France and Belgium. Soldiers were forced to move across this heavily armed space in an attempt to capture enemy territory. Tragically, many of the soldiers who tried to cross no man's land wouldn't make it back, and this space became associated with violence and destruction, as we can see in the picture. But you might be surprised to learn that a number of so-called no man's lands still exist today. The term is usually used to describe spaces which are unoccupied or unclaimed by sovereign powers. So when thinking back to our equation at the start of this presentation, these are territories which lack sovereignty. That is, they're areas of the Earth that no one officially claims. One example of this is the United Nations buffer zone, located in the southern European island of Cyprus. The island, which was previously a British colony, has been divided since 1974, following fighting between Greek and Turkish forces. The buffer zone separates the Greek Cypriot community, who live in the southern half of the island, with the Turkish Cypriot community, who live in the north. And today the buffer zone is home to abandoned houses, shops, and even an airport. It's exactly the same as it was when it was left in 1974. Today, the buffer zone is looked after by the United Nations peacekeeping forces, as we can see on this sign, and members of the public are very, very rarely allowed to enter. Another, even more intriguing example of no man's land is Bir Tawil. This is an 800 square mile patch of land wedged between Egypt and Sudan. Bir Tawil remains unclaimed by both countries and is often described as the last truly unclaimed space on Earth. This situation exists because the British, who formerly colonised much of this area of northern Africa, produced two different maps, one in 1898 and the other in 1901. One gave Bir Tawil to Egypt and the other gave it to Sudan. You might think that this would mean that both countries would make a claim to this space, but importantly, the map that gave Egypt Bir Tawil gave Sudan a much larger, more economically productive patch of land called the Halaib Triangle, whilst the map that gave Egypt the Halaib Triangle gave Sudan Bir Tawil. This is a bit confusing, but is hopefully made clearer by looking at the map on the slide. If either country were to recognise the map that includes Bir Tawil within their territory, they'd have to give up their claim to the Halaib Triangle, which they'd rather have because of its economic value. Because of this, Bir Tawil remains unclaimed. But while these spaces might seem like sovereign no man's lands, which they are, that does not mean that they are empty. Geography academics Alistair Pinkerton and Noah Lesham attempted to visit Bir Tawil as part of a journey across different no man's lands in 2015. They describe how Bir Tawil has a rich history and continues to play an important role as grazing land for members of their local tribe. Similarly, part of my previous research explored how the Cyprus buffer zone still plays a key role in the lives of the island's citizens, and is the subject of much debate about how the space should be used if the island is ever reunited. The existence of no man's land then challenges the idea that the world is broken up into neat blocks of territorial states controlled by single sovereigns. In Cyprus, the buffer zone is controlled by an international organisation, rather than a state, and in Bir Tawil, no country claims sovereignty. Thinking back to our equation at the start of the presentation then, these can be seen as territories without sovereignty. In the next section, we'll think about how studying these spaces is vital to understanding the future of global politics. So, having looked at 3 examples of geopolitical anomalies, I want to end by reflecting on what they can teach us about the world, and particularly about geography and global politics. First though, it's worth mentioning that the 3 examples we've explored today are just one of a very small number of hundreds of geopolitical anomalies that exist around the world. Others include enclaves, where the land of one state is surrounded by another state, overseas territories like the Falkland Islands, city-states like Singapore, crown dependencies like the Isle of Man, partially unrecognised states like Palestine and Kosovo, non-administered autonomous areas, including parts of Pakistan, virtual states which exist only online, and insurgent states, to name but a few. All of these challenge our understanding of the world as only made up of territorially sovereign states. So, as social science students, what can geopolitical anomalies really teach us about how the world operates? Well, first, geopolitical anomalies can help us question the neat equation that I showed you at the start of this presentation, that a state always equals territory plus sovereignty. The Tibetan government in exile, for example, represents a form of de facto sovereignty without control over territory, while micronations like Sealand claim territory but only occupy a very small space, often artificial. Understanding how these different states come into being and operate can help us better understand the workings of global politics and the way in which power operates in different ways and in different places. What I really hope this presentation has shown you is the huge variety of different geopolitical entities that exist in the interstate system, as well as the normal countries on the maps we're shown. Second, as exceptions to the rule, geopolitical anomalies help us think about what the rules of the international state system really are. For example, looking at how Sealand and other micronations struggle without recognition helps show us how important recognition really is to becoming a state. Meanwhile, the no man's land in Beer to Will helps show us how maps and historical claims are often key to the basis of present-day state boundaries. You might be asking at this point, if so many different geopolitical anomalies exist, can the sovereign's territorial state really be considered normal and the ideal? And this is just the type of question we're interested in the study of geopolitics, and looking at geopolitical anomalies can help us get a much better understanding of what's really going on. Finally, geopolitical anomalies can help us think about how geopolitics might play out in the future. This might seem abstract, but we're already seeing this play out in debates over climate change and the refugee crisis. Climate change poses a significant threat to all states, but particularly to small islands in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, who risk being flooded or disappearing completely due to rising sea levels. Proposals for the future of these states include buying land in other countries, or even creating new artificial islands, as we can see on these newspaper headlines. Thinking about the experience of the Tibetan government in exile as a state without territory, and micronations like Sealand, whose claim to sovereignty is based on an artificial territory, might help us understand the challenges these states could face in the future. Similarly, in recent years we've seen a growth in no man's lands associated with the refugee crisis across Europe. Keen to assert their own territorial sovereignty and control who is allowed in and who isn't allowed within a given territorial state, governments are increasingly strengthening their borders. As a result, asylum seekers, who have often made extremely dangerous journeys to reach Europe, are forced into a state of limbo, trapped in kind of no man's land between borders, where no government will offer them assistance, and effectively, no government will claim sovereignty. It's likely that as climate change continues to displace communities across the world, more of these no man's lands will appear. So understanding how no man's lands have been seen, constructed, and engaged with in historical terms and in the present will help us understand how to navigate these challenges in the future. So I just wanted to finish by giving you some further questions to think about on your own. If you have any thoughts about any of these or any additional responses, you can email them to the address at the end of this presentation, and we might be able to produce a follow-up video with some responses. So first, think about what challenges there are to the territorial state in the present era. You could think about how this operates from above. What threat does globalization pose to the idea of the territorial sovereign state? Multinational corporations have a lot of power, and what does the change in rapid flow of people, goods and money really mean for state territorial sovereignty? You could also here think about international institutions, like the EU, the World Trade Organization, or the United Nations. And you can also think about this question from below. How do regional movements, like those in Catalan, Scotland, or the Basque Country, threaten the territorial state? Second, think about whether a state has to have territory to exist. What role could the internet play in the life of geopolitical anomalies, such as governments in exile or microstates? And finally, what challenges might you face if you tried to set up a micronation in your living room? Here, go back to the criteria we originally came up with of what comprises a state, and think about which of those would be easier to meet than others. So finally then, here's some further reading if you want to learn more about geopolitics or the topic of geopolitical anomalies. I'd particularly recommend Klaus Dodds' very short introduction to geopolitics, whose picture is on the slide. This gives you a really good overview, is very accessible, and is quite short, at about 150 to 200 pages. Into No Man's Land explores the journey of two academics trying to visit no man's lands around the world. You can also look at the Geographical magazine pieces on micronations and unrecognised nations at the United Nations. There's the sealand.gov.org website, which might be worth looking at to see how Sealand tries to make itself appear like a state online. And finally, there's a fantastic Guardian long read called Welcome to the Land That No Country Wants, which explores the contemporary and historical significance of Beer to Will. It's also available as a podcast, if you'd rather listen instead of reading. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions about any of this presentation, about the material covered in this lecture, or about related courses at university, please email them to inspire@sjc.ox.ac.uk, and a selection of your questions might be answered in future programme videos.